It is my sad duty to announce that the United States has declared war on the Islamic Republic of Iran.
So that's the topic we're talking about tonight. So let me start by just saying thank you all for coming out for this evening workshop on deepfakes and the next generation of digital disinformation. I have to start by saying thank you to Google for actually funding this workshop. My name is Eileen Donahoe. I am the Executive Director of Stanford's Global Digital Policy Incubator and a member of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. The commission is co-chaired by Anders Rasmussen, the former Prime Minister of Denmark and the host of this whole summit, and Michael Chertoff, the former Secretary of Homeland Security in the United States. The commission is made up of about 14 different people who've served in various roles in government, diplomacy, come from journalism and different sectors. And we were brought together to try to help generate policy ideas and some political will to help defend the integrity of democratic elections. And we are working to facilitate greater transatlantic cooperation as well as much greater collaboration with the tech sector. The commission has focused a great deal of our attention on a peculiarly confounding problem as it relates to election integrity that we are all dealing with, which is the problem of digital disinformation. And we have also chosen to prioritize one dimension of that digital disinformation threat, which is the threat of deepfakes. So in this workshop, we have 3 presentations that you will get from people who are leaders working at the cutting edge of either deepfake technology or this disinformation threat generally. And our goal is to give you a broad sense of the technology behind deepfakes, as well as some practical solutions that are being deployed to combat disinformation generally. I'm going to say a couple of words just to take a moment to set the stage and say a few words about why we think the deepfake threat is so urgent. And then we'll hear from our 3 fabulous speakers. But before we do that, we were hoping to make this session as interactive and vibrant as possible and to get as much of your input as we could. And so we want to ask all of you to take a quick survey on 3 questions related to deepfakes. And this will require that you actually pull out your phones. And I'm hoping a large subset of you has actually downloaded the app for the summit. Actually, let me raise your hands if you have a phone with the app downloaded. Okay, excellent. Get out your phones. That's great. Good job. And tap on the app. You have to scroll down to this section. It's the interactive workshop on deepfakes. And we're going to start with a first question, and we're going to ask you to put in an answer. You guys, it's up? Okay. There it is. Okay, so the first question, for those of you who don't have the app, which forms of disinformation are most problematic in your home context? And then we give a variety of options. Disinformation against candidates and politicians, disinformation campaigns against civil society, micro-targeted political advertising on digital platforms, closed platform viral deception, or disinformation in traditional media. Those are the subset of options, and you get to pick one. And then your responses will show up on the screen. Where does it come up? You have to open the workshop. I got it. It says live poll. Everybody see live poll? Right below that, it didn't say live poll for you? Does just below, so at the very bottom of my screen, it says live poll. How many people have live poll? Okay, everybody who sees live poll, tap on it. Those are your options. Try it. This is an experiment. You're the guinea pigs. Okay, everybody just about done? We're going to move to question number 2. Does that come up itself, you guys? Oh, it has to go 60 seconds. They're going to shorten the timing next time. Oh, 50. So it reloaded the first question, looks like. Okay. Second question, for those of you who don't have it. Are you more concerned about A, government inaction on disinformation, or B, overreaching government responses to disinformation that undermine democratic values, such as excessive content-based restrictions on speech? Just 2 options. Okay, great. And then last question. Which entities are best placed to combat disinformation? Governments, civil society and civic educators, private sector digital platforms, independent journalists, independent technologists, or some combination? Okay, while you guys are finishing that survey, I'm just going to launch into a little bit of an intro on the subject of deep fakes and speak a little bit to this question of why this is such an urgent threat. As most of you are probably well aware, deep fakes are AI synthesized media that allow their producers to make it appear that someone did or said something they did not do or say. And this can be done either by stitching the face of one person onto existing video of another person in a way that's invisible to the human eye, or by completely fabricating the movement and location of the targeted person. New developments in the audio dimension allow custom machine learning models to imitate voices of specific human beings with very high fidelity to the actual voice of the targeted person, just by typing in text. And this combination of synthesized video and voice impersonation is a really potent combination. It could be a game changer on the disinformation front. That said, deepfakes really need to be understood as part of a very wide spectrum of various forms of disinformation that bleed into each other. For example, there are many less sophisticated forms of video and audio manipulation, sometimes called cheap fakes or shallow fakes, such as the recent tape of Nancy Pelosi, where the video was slowed down, or the tape of the journalist Jim Acosta, where the video was sped up to make it look like he was making a violent motion. As we try to address these new forms of manipulated video and audio, we also need to acknowledge that we have not really gotten our hands around how to combat earlier generations of digital disinformation and even text-based disinformation. While many people have done great diagnostics, including Ambassador Freed, who's here in the audience, about how digital disinformation works, most governments have been very slow, and most stakeholders have been slow to develop effective ways to actually combat disinformation. And there are lots of reasons for this, some of which has to do with lack of political will in some countries. We'll save that subject. But there is an important principled reason that democracies have been slow to respond to the threat of disinformation, and it relates to the fact that we are deeply committed to the fundamental principle of freedom of expression. Access to information is the lifeblood of democracy and is central to the empowerment of citizens. Democratic governments have, for good reason, been reticent to restrict access to information or expand the categories of content that are criminalized in the name of protecting democracy. And it turns out it is really hard to craft a regulatory response to disinformation that simultaneously protects free expression and democratic process and engagement. That said, continuing with this slow and ineffectual response to disinformation is untenable in the context of deep fakes. And we need a much greater sense of urgency about it for two very basic reasons. The first of which is practical. The prospects that deep fakes will be deployed in ways that impact the outcome of democratic elections is about to increase dramatically for the simple reason that the technology will become much more widely available. Deepfakes used to require highly trained producers. It was labor-intensive, time-intensive, and cost-prohibitive for most malign actors. But we are now on the cusp of democratizing and scaling access to these fabrication tools for AI-generated video and audio, and it is now estimated that this technology will be widely available within about 2 years or so, and maybe Marc will clarify that. And this really has the potential to kind of blow the lid off our political reality if it happens. Democracy depends on having a baseline sense of political reality or factual truth. Individuals are only able to exercise their democratic right to participate in choosing their elected officials if they have trustworthy information about candidates. People like to trust their own eyes and ears when judging political candidates. Citizens want to see and hear candidates for themselves. And political deepfakes, when unleashed in an election period, could destroy this capacity and undercut citizens' ability to assess candidates for themselves. And that's pretty fundamental. This, in turn, would destroy the broad societal conditions necessary for democracy. So, simply put, deepfakes could cut even deeper than the disinformation we've seen to date into the fabric of our shared rational understanding of political reality. And people could come to believe nothing is true, that civic engagement is not worth the effort. And in many ways, I'm sure you all know, this is the goal of many of the foreign information operations, to undermine confidence in the superiority and feasibility of democracy itself. As I noted earlier, while it's easy to imagine how deep fakes could be deployed to disrupt an election. I'm sure each of you could envision that. It's very hard to craft a regulatory response that doesn't undermine free expression. So as an alternative to regulation, the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity is also focused on civic education to combat deep fakes. But we are cognizant of the fact that if not done carefully, publicizing the threat of deep fakes itself could also erode public confidence in the information realm. Last but not least, there is the risk that the cry or use of the term deep fakes could be co-opted, just like the term fake news. And the charge that something is a deep fake could become a shield for liars and authoritarians everywhere. So there are many layers of complication to this threat. So we're now going to turn to our wonderful speakers who have agreed to be with us this evening. Let me briefly introduce them all together, and they'll take turns sharing their individual projects with you. We're going to start with a demo by Mark Warner, who is the founder and CEO of Faculty, a leading data science company doing cutting-edge work on deep fakes. And Mark is going to provide a snapshot of the technology behind synthetic media, as well as an AI-based detection technology he has created to combat deepfakes. We will then turn to Stephen Brill, a renowned journalist and founder and co-CEO of NewsGuard. Stephen's going to give you a sense of some of the practical solutions being deployed in the realm of journalism to combat disinformation. And he'll share elements of the NewsGuard initiative, which is a news site rating system, and it's supported significantly by Microsoft. Then we will turn to Susan Ness, who served as a commissioner of the U.S. Federal Communications Commission and currently chairs the Transatlantic High-Level Working Group on Content Moderation and Free Expression. And Susan will engage all of you in conversation about challenges associated with crafting government regulatory responses, as well as private sector policies to address disinformation, while simultaneously protecting core commitment to free expression. And after the three speakers, we are going to come back to all of you, and we're going to actually take a look at the survey results. We'll go to all of you for questions as well as comments. We want to hear from you about your own experience of disinformation or any experience with deep fakes, shallow fakes in your own context. And we really want to have a lively exchange to the extent possible. So we will start with Marc.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for having me. So I'm from a company called Faculty. We're an artificial intelligence company based in London, and we basically build AI software to help solve our clients' problems. So these can range from helping the trains run on time to detecting terrorist videos on the web. But I'm here today to talk about our work in political disinformation in collaboration with the Alliance of Democracies. So, of course, political disinformation is not a new phenomenon. It's as old as politics and was a core part of the 20th century Cold War playbook, but it was hard to do well. So in the sort of 100 years ago or 50 years ago even well-resourced state agencies were going to struggle. You needed sort of believable content and the channels through which it could be distributed. And occasionally, these would come together, such as this example in 1924, the Zinoviev letter, where the Daily Mail published it a few days before the 1924 UK general election. It purported to show that an election of the Labour Party would drive Leninism across the United Kingdom, but is now thought to be fake. But because the mass channels of newspapers were relatively rare and they had highly educated gatekeepers, they were sort of hard to co-opt. Of course, now in the days of the web and the social media, the channels are much more available and there are no gatekeepers anymore. And so with modern powerful technologies, political disinformation can take new forms. So in 2016, we saw the creation of many false internet articles that were shared online. And the dynamics of social media can, at least allegedly, cause echo chambers that lead to the sharing and resharing of content. In 2020, we'll face a new threat. We'll be able to create these entirely artificial videos of public figures synthesized through the use of cutting-edge AI called deepfakes. And so these will enable anyone with the technical sophistication of sort of a relatively moderate software developer in a startup to build extremely realistic footage of presidential candidates saying anything. And the fact that it's video matters quite a lot, because when something is seen by your own eyes and ears, it's just much more visceral and much more believable. Of course, this is why news reporters work so hard to get war footage and things like that. And in 2020, this is going to be thrown into a very febrile environment. Almost all political factions are up in arms about the fake news created by the other side. And our politics appears extremely fragmented, with the historical coalitions moving underneath people's feet and the measured trust in society fairly low. So what are the technologies that will subvert this threat and how do they work? So in general, deepfakes are synthetic videos synthesized with deep learning, hence the name. And they require these two parts, the image, the sort of video, and the audio. And as Eileen said, the simplest way is just to take the face of somebody and swap it onto the face of somebody else. But more complicated methods involve training an artificial intelligence model that can then just basically generate footage of the particular person. So the audio techniques mostly derived from work by DeepMind, a UK company now owned by Google, built on by NVIDIA to generate speech from text. I guess in both cases, for either the audio or video, a key requirement is that you have several hours of footage of the public person. Now, of course, in the example of any politician or celebrity, that is relatively easy from all of the things available on YouTube. And as Eileen says, we think that these can be pixel perfect within a few years. Now, of course, that is pixel perfect at very high cost to cutting edge institutions, but as the technology develops, that will drip down to more and more normal people. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes explaining a little bit about how these things work, because they're not actually that magical. They rely on a technology called artificial neural networks. So these are a sort of mathematization inspired by the human brain. So in the brain, we have neurons that take a few inputs and give an output, and then they're arrayed into a big network in the brain. And that's how we think that we're able to do our image recognition, and humans do it. And so in the case of artificial neural networks, we create a sort of mathematical version of this in the computer. And then we string loads of them together and make instead of having a neuron, we have a network of neurons, an artificial neural net. And then we take a piece of speech where we have both the text and the sound wave. And we basically take a section of that and ask the algorithm to figure out how to predict the sound wave. We give it the sound wave and basically say, here's the text, here's the sound wave. Now figure out a set of parameters in this net that allows you to predict one from the other. And it goes through and trains a load of parameters. And ultimately, that allows us to take that net and then put new words in. So then we can put in something like Trump, and it now makes a guess, makes a prediction about what the sound wave coming out the other side would look like. And that's how you can generate the kind of sound files. So let's have a look at the progression of this technology. So the first examples were released anonymously on Reddit, actually. And I think it's important to point out that this wasn't the output of some enormous research project, but was the sort of digital equivalent of some kid inventing a machine gun in their garage. Of course, being the internet, the first application was for adult movies. And so this is Daisy Ridley, the Star Wars actress, spliced into some kind of adult movie. But then in 2018, the same content was made available via a graphical user interface. And so it didn't take long for people to start applying this to politics. Now, many of you may have seen this Jordan Peele impersonation of Barack Obama, where actually Jordan Peele's lips are stitched on to Barack Obama. So this is an example of a face swap where they just sort of take some lips. And it's actually an impersonation, so the voice is Jordan Peele.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit.
So that was the state of the art in 2015, where the voice was entirely an impression and the lips were just stitched across. By late 2018, it was possible to puppet an entire body. So in the top left corner, this is an actual dancer. The computer is picking up the pose in the bottom left corner and then mapping that onto an entirely different person so that she's copying the moves of the top left person. And then finally, in late 2018, or maybe early 2019, never mind fake news, we had an entirely fake newscaster.
Hello, everyone. I'm an English artificial intelligence anchor. This is my very first day in Xinhua News Agency. My voice and appearance are modeled on Zhang Zhao, a real anchor with Xinhua. The development of the media industry calls for continuous innovation and deep integration with the international advanced technologies.
So that was totally synthesized, trained on a particular Chinese news anchor, but the voice and the image entirely synthetic. So eventually both public institutions and the public in general will evolve their expectations to trust in video. But that could take a long time. I mean, we're 30 years into Photoshop and still some people believe the front covers of glossy magazines. And so while we adjust, we're most at risk. And we think, the first attack could have the largest impact because it will take people off guard. And so what would an attack look like? Well, of course, you want to be thoughtful about who to target, where to target, and when to target them. And we imagine that this should be done in the context of some hard-to-deny event. So, for instance, you could imagine hacking a system and dumping a load of data where a deepfake is only one piece of a kind of very complicated, like huge number of documents alongside it. And it makes it very hard for anyone to concretely understand what's going on or pick it out and kind of deny a specific piece of this. You'd have to say, well, all of these things are true, but this one isn't true, and just wouldn't be very believable. So by doing a sort of subtle, thoughtful attack, you can imagine it having much more impact. And then if you do it in key swing states just before an election, it seems at least plausible that you could make a real difference to the outcome. And so what are we doing about this? Well, with the Alliance of Democracies and ourselves, we're designing solutions to mitigate the impact of deepfakes. In a world where the access to this technology has been democratized and it's much more commonly available. And so, as Eileen said, there's basically three parts to the strategy: building the public awareness, empowering the press, and connecting multiple contributors. And this can only really be done effectively by like a broad coalition of organizations, because it needs the policy, it needs the media, and it needs the technology all to come together. So our strategy is built around some simple premises. Basically, in the long term, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to detect these deepfakes with any algorithms. It's essentially an arms race where the output can, in principle, be pixel perfect eventually. And so the only long-term defense is kind of critical thinking and public education. And so we've been doing this through a variety of different news channels, working with very trusted organizations like the BBC and the Telegraph and CNBC in the US to start to educate the public. And so we'll just play a little game. This is Donald Trump, human or computer.
We have requested more agents, immigration judges, and bed space to process the sharp rise in unlawful migration fueled by our very strong economy.
Real or fake?
My administration has presented Congress with a detailed proposal to secure the border and stop the criminal gangs, drug smugglers, and human traffickers. It's a tremendous problem. But all.
Oh, you can leave it there. So actually, if you know what to listen for, you still can tell in a kind of quiet room like this with reasonably high quality speakers which one is which. But of course, it's really easy to with a bit of stagecraft, like play that down a mobile phone and pretend it was, you know, like somebody talking down a mobile phone, and then it is, even if you know what you're listening for, it's totally impossible to tell the difference. So in the short term, these fakes are less than perfect, and actually, truthfully, they should always be thought of as a security threat. So for those of you that have worked in sort of cybersecurity or anything like that, you'll know there's no such thing as perfect security. And really all you're trying to do is make it sufficiently costly for any particular threat model, like threat to attack you. And so, you know, a sort of silly example of this is even if the kind of KGB equivalent can break into your house without you ever knowing, you still lock your front door because you want to prevent petty criminals from stealing off you as well. And so there's always a place for defending against sort of lower quality threats, even in a world where it's pixel perfect for the kind of absolute cutting edge. So this is an example of our work to detect face swaps, one of the simplest algorithms. And so you can see that basically the kind of highlighted areas are what the algorithm uses to determine this kind of signatures of whether something is real or fake. And then finally, all of this work can be supercharged with collaborators. So we think this is a very important problem, and we're only able to work on some aspects of it. And we'd love to collaborate with a wider set of people, whether people have ideas of how to implement this, research of their own, or data around deepfakes. We'd love to talk to you. So, you know, I think these are a very important problem over the next few years, but they offer an opportunity for the tech industry and, in particular, sort of political classes and media to take a step ahead of a potential problem. And so if you think there's any way that you can help or have any interest in helping us, we would love to talk to you. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, Stephen Brill.
Thank you. Is this on? And I'll wait for... Excellent. The best way to summarize what NewsGuard does and the problem that NewsGuard attempts to solve, let me just get to the beginning, is we are exactly the opposite of the work that my friend who preceded me is doing. And I think there's an important place for both of us. And what's the reason for that? Well, if you think about deepfakes, the only way you're going to get at them ultimately is by smarter technology, which you have demonstrated. If you think about misinformation and fake news, it's only a technology problem to the extent that technology has enabled, for better or worse, everyone in the world to be a publisher. But the whole goal of fake news, of misinformation, is to look and feel and sound exactly like real news. And there's no way to tell the difference with AI at all. That's why there's no algorithm that can spot skillful misinformation. That's why the Denver Guardian, which was a phony website attempting to look like a newspaper in Denver, Colorado, was so successful. Its logo, its look, its feel, the tone of the words was exactly like the Denver Post. On the other hand, any human being with an IQ of over 80, and most of the people who work for NewsGuard actually meet that standard, any of them would have figured out that the Pope really didn't endorse Mr. Trump for president. Or they might have said, well, before I report that, maybe I'll call the Vatican and just check on that. And so that's the difference. What NewsGuard does is uses real human beings, highly trained people who have experience in the journalism world, to fight misinformation. And the way we do it is not with fact-checking. I mean, we do fact-checking, but that's not what we are. What we are is a site that, what we are is a company that rates the overall reliability and trustworthiness of news sites. Therefore, if a news site were to publish a deep fake, let's say it was, RT, which is rated red by NewsGuard, that red rating would be right there with the deep fake. So here's what our mission is, which I've described to you, and I've described to you how we do it. And again, I'll emphasize it would be hard to find a way to combat misinformation without restraints on free expression, except for what NewsGuard is doing. Because what NewsGuard is doing is combating misinformation with more good information. So I don't think it's an either-or choice. I don't think you either have to have the status quo of all the misinformation that's out there today, or government restraints, or Facebook restraints. Facebook saying, let's take this down, or let's suppress this, or Google with a secret algorithm saying, let's suppress this result. I think the answer is not that false choice. I think the answer is in between. The answer is that in a democracy, the way you fight misinformation is with information, with real information. And that is what we try to do. And as you can tell, we attempt to read and rate sites in a way that is apolitical. If you looked at the sites, we've now rated 2,200 sites in the United States and about 800 across Italy, France, Germany, and the UK. And if you tried to develop a pattern, even if you used artificial intelligence to try to develop a pattern and say, well, have they leaned in favor of conservative sites or liberal sites or old mainstream media or new digital-only media, you would not see a pattern. The only pattern you would see is if these sites adhere to the 9 criteria that we spell out. And we have 2 people at the start reading and reviewing each site. Then there are 2 editors. Then there are 2 senior editors. It is a long and thoughtful process. Now, how do we achieve scale? Once again, we are rating the overall reliability of sites, not the reliability of every article. We don't think that individual fact-checking can ever achieve scale, but we do draw on the work of all the fact-checking groups that are out there. We credit them, but we also re-report what they conclude, because we observe the first rule of journalism, which is you always ask people for comment. So we call every site for comment. And it probably sounds horribly inefficient to all of you, but again, you achieve scale by worrying about the sites, not about the individual articles. The other thing I'll point out is that we are the opposite of an algorithm in every way. Our 9 criteria are listed on the nutrition label that we publish for each site, and we want people to game our system. We want people to say, gee, if I had a better policy and if I adhered to the corrections policy standard that NewsGuard has, I'd get a higher rating. In the United States, over 500 websites have changed their policies to get a higher rating. And that's why we started the company. That's a good thing. Now, how do people see the ratings? Right now, we have a browser plugin that you can download. And if you download it, whenever you see a Facebook news feed, a Twitter news feed, do a Google search, a Bing search, lots of different places, the red and green label will ride with you on each of those sites. and then if you hover over the red or green, you'll begin to read the nutrition label. So here's an example, and it's an important example. This is a website in the United States called dailyhealthpost.com. And that seems pretty innocent, right? I mean, it didn't switch? Sorry, there it is. Okay, dailyhealthpost.com. Sounds like a perfectly good site. And if you believe that cannabis oil will cure leukemia, and you can stop going to your cancer doctor, this is the site for you. Now, no matter what new article they write, that red label will be there on the Facebook feed, unless, of course, they change their practices. We're constantly updating these ratings. Now, there's something else I should note there. Those of you who are from the United States know that Geico is an insurance company in the United States. In fact, it's owned by Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company. That ad is there because of programmatic advertising. And we have another product that we license to ad agencies and advertisers, but I guess not yet to Geico, that keeps them off of sites that have a red rating. There are ads on this particular site for Whole Foods, for drug companies, for healthcare companies, for Nike, for for J. Crew, you name it. So here's an example of the, sorry about that, the nutrition label almost in full. It actually goes another page. But what you'll notice there is an explicit laying out of why this site gets the rating that it gets. You can click through and read about the background of the authors, the editors. You can click through for more information, which defines the 9 criteria. Everything is meant to be, again, the opposite of an algorithm, which means it's completely transparent. Here's another example of a site, Reuters, which actually changed one of its practices in order to get 100% green. It originally did not adhere to the criteria of disclosing on the website who the top editor was, or the top editors are, and how to reach that person if you have a complaint. Here is another example of how NewsGuard is used. This is next to a link, a Facebook link, and this is another, actually this is another anti-vaxxer site called Natural News. It turns out that, I think the guy who publishes this, when we gave this a read, he started a whole new site with the exact same content, and we were able to catch it because the one place where we do use artificial intelligence is we track the fingerprints of sites so that if a site comes up that we haven't rated yet, but is the same site of something that we've rated, we will take a look at it, and that's the result. This is an example of the application that Microsoft has licensed for its mobile edge, where you can see here exactly. That, by the way, is a very good example of why NewsGuard is so important for the overall news literacy business. That is a website called What is Fracking? Now, if you had downloaded the plugin and you did a Google search or a Bing search for what is fracking, that is the second site that would come up in that search. The first, I think, is there's a BBC article about fracking. So, that makes sense. You search for what is fracking, and you get whatisfracking.com. And when you start reading it, it reads like a sober discussion, with lots of science jargon, of the pros and cons of fracking. Except as you read it, what you read is it's mostly pros. In fact, the only con is that there isn't enough fracking going on in the world. Turns out it's owned and operated by the American Petroleum Institute, only they don't tell you that. So one of the reasons that school systems and libraries across the US and now in Europe have adopted NewsGuard and put it on their computers and use NewsGuard as a media literacy tool is exactly that. For exactly that reason, knowing who your sources are. And the last thing I'll stress again is how we think of ourselves as the only way people will trust us to do this is if we're transparent and if we are completely accountable for what we do. And these are just some examples of how we adhere to that kind of accountability. If a news site complains about anything we've said about them, we post the complaint. We also, as I said before, we call them first for comment before we say anything bad about them. Journalists call people for comment, algorithms don't. Here's an example, or here are some examples of how we've been regarded now that we've been up for several months, actually almost a year in the United States. And what you'll see is that serious news sites across the board, whether they're on the left, on the right, or in the middle, appreciate what we're doing. Because what we're really about is the difference, again, between the Denver Guardian and the Denver Post, or those anti-vaxxer sites. The last slide, I'll just re-emphasize that we consider ourselves to be the most potent, tangible, useful, accessible news literacy tool out there because we deal in specifics. And by looking at our labels, there are teachers who give their kids exercises where they attempt to write their own nutrition labels and check their own boxes and then compare it with what we did. And again, in libraries now all around the world, the plugin has been installed on the computers of people. And you know, there are many of them, very high percentages in lots of countries whose only broadband access is at the public library. So I will close with that, and I'll look forward to questions later. Thank you.
Good evening. Eileen had this wonderful technology that everyone used to be able to vote interactively on some of the questions that she had raised. I'm also going to raise some questions with you, but we're going to use an even higher level of technology. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. And what I'm going to ask you about is, she mentioned Speaker Pelosi, and what was not really a deep fake, it's what was called a cheap fake, because it did not use very sophisticated technology at all, just simply to slow down the tape so it appears as though she's slurring her words. So if you were a large platform, let me see a quick show of hands. How many of you would have taken down that video? Okay. How many of you would have done what Facebook did, which was basically to demonetize, to label it, and decelerate its views? Show of hands? Okay, so most of you would have taken it down. What if it had been spliced, for those who would have left it on but labeled it, what if it had been splicing together two videos completely separate, or had made it appear that she'd contradicted herself? How many would have left that up, possibly with labels? Okay. So basically, these are the kinds of decisions that platforms have to render very quickly and daily and at scale. And that's the question that's raised today. Do we want private companies to be making these determinations which do affect elections and democracy? Or Is this a role for government, or is this a role for perhaps multi-stakeholder engagement? What have governments been doing so far? In France, last November, France enacted 2 fake news laws to rein in false information during election campaigns. At a candidate's request, judges can order immediate removal of fake news during the 3 months prior to a national election. Journalists and others have objected, fearing censorship of the press. The French National Broadcasting Authority was given power to suspend TV channels that are controlled or under the influence of a foreign state if they deliberately disseminate false information likely to affect the sincerity of a ballot. Russia Today and Sputnik protested. In May, France also published a draft legislative proposal to create a social media platform regulator whose focus would not be on content, but rather on ensuring that the platforms are transparent in how they moderate content and how they apply their terms of service, giving users a right of redress for unjust takedown of content. On the other hand, Singapore's new law requires social media sites to carry warnings on posts that the government deems false, remove comments that are against the public interest, which it defines, by the way, as threats to its security, foreign relations, electoral integrity, and public perception of the government and state institutions. Malaysia, that ousted government, passed a fake news law, which it used to curb free speech that had, not surprisingly, zeroed in on Prime Minister's alleged graft. He lost the election anyway. However, a Danish citizen was sentenced to a week in jail for an accurate criticism of the Malaysian policy on social media. I just read it online. It could be fake news. I do not know, but that's what I read. Russia finds Russians who spread what authorities determine to be fake news or who show blatant disrespect for state online. Government may block websites that do not respond to calls to remove inaccurate information. The European Union has expanded its program to share information with member states on info operations by foreign actors. The Commission has issued a communication on disinformation last year, outlining a variety of actions the EC would take apart from banning content. The Commission is deeply split between those who have lived under communist regime and are fearful of establishing a ministry of truth, and those who see paramount the role of the government to protect its citizens from disinformation. The package included EU support for an independent network of European fact-checkers and launched a secure online platform to facilitate their work. It also set up a voluntary code of practice, voluntary, for a handful of platforms who have pledged to take specific steps to counter disinformation on their platforms, and they were required to provide monthly updates on their activities. The UK just recently issued a white paper proposing to create a duty of care, requiring platforms to address lawful but harmful content in addition to illegal content. And the United States has been eyeing a variety of measures to combat disinformation online. They fall into a couple of buckets. Looking at the bad actors, it strengthened enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act to require foreign government media such as RT and Sputnik to register as foreign agents. Proposed, but not enacted yet, is the Honest Ads Act, which was introduced by Senators Klobuchar and Warner, that would require transparency and accountability on political advertising to prevent, once again, foreign governments from interfering in US elections. And Congresswoman Yvette Clarke introduced legislation to label videos found to be manipulated, and they need to be marked with digital watermark or audio disclosure. Once again, this is a bill, it's not law. Very popular at the moment are ideas to amend or repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, to condition or remove the safe harbor for intermediary platforms. Some Republicans are pushing platforms to favor or at least not disfavor their right-wing content, as platforms have been taking down or banning websites with white supremacy messages and other instigation of violence. Senator Ted Cruz introduced legislation that would require the Federal Trade Commission to certify by a supermajority vote that a platform was neutral in its moderation decisions and not favoring Democrats over Republicans. And this would have to take place, this super vote in the Federal Trade Commission, before they would have the protection of the safe harbor. Senator Warner suggests removing safe harbor protections for failure to take down deepfake or other manipulated video content when presented with a court judgment against the uploader. He would further require platforms to use hashing technology to prevent reoccurrence. So there's an awful lot of ideas and interest going on. Government has a lot of roles that it can play. It can be a convener that brings stakeholders together around solutions for deepfakes. It's researcher-in-chief, heading and funding cutting-edge research on AI. It's a bully pulpit to cajole platforms and actors to address the issue. It's an educator, alerting the public to harms of deepfakes and disinformation. It's a funder for fact-checking organizations, with outside organizations making the determination who gets funded. It's a regulator. It should work with platforms and civil society on standard setting. And it's a partner to work with the private sector to implement digital verification signatures designating time, date, physical origins of content. It's also an enforcer. It can enforce or expand consumer protection laws against unfair and deceptive practices. And it's a leader. It can enact legislation to permit the government itself and elected officials from creating and distributing false and manipulated content for their campaigns. And it's a national protector. When there's an information ops attack from foreign-controlled entities, it has a strong obligation to use a different set of tools to disrupt such operations. It's a very different game. And the government can deploy from its toolbox diplomacy, criminal charges with extradition, economic sanctions, information ops against the adversary itself, and disabling the perpetrator's access to the internet. And all of this can be done in the context that does not harm freedom of expression. So what other tools are there? What can platforms and civil society do to address this issue in a positive way? The concern being oftentimes under pressure, a lot of content will be taken down, marked as disinformation, unfairly. Maybe it's satire. There may be other reasons why it was up. So rather than leaving it to the platforms to make these subjective judgments, one great idea is to establish what could become a social media council with a range of experts from civil society and academia. Depending upon its structure and remit, the council or councils could advise on the really tough cases, a Pelosi situation, for example, to form a body of decisions that would inform a company's content moderation policies. On a national or even global scale, it could develop international norms for determining, demoting, demonetizing, or deleting information and blocking bad actors. What can the judiciary do? Disinformation and deepfakes involve speech. The judicial system can play a fundamental role in deciding what is protected speech and what is unlawful. rather than leaving it to the platforms or the government to make these determinations. One idea being floated about is a national e-court for content moderation disputes. The platform or user whose content was deleted can obtain immediate redress on a rocket docket with trained independent magistrates whose collective decisions will guide future moderation. It would all be done online with no right of appeal. So, in conclusion, those who are using disinformation and deep fakes intentionally to cause harm to individuals or society are winning the technology arms race right now. It's imperative that governments, technology companies, and civil society partner to address this growing problem without undermining freedom of expression, which is the underpinning, as we all know, for a free and open society. Thank you.
That was really a fabulous combination. I think, we heard about cutting-edge technology to combat cutting-edge threat. We heard about going back to basics, using human judgment to evaluate, old school. But I thought your point about it's not to restrict free expression, it is more information to combat the threat of disinformation. We have to remember that. When you go back to evaluation, that's not undermining free expression. And then,
I don't know what you're
Yeah.
so worried about moderating.
well, so and then I just will say, all the complexity of the risks associated with lots of different government regulation. I think the moderating thing is about the power of a private sector entity to control civic discourse.
But, well, maybe that's an antitrust question, but moderating is one person's word for editing. If I am publishing something, I should be responsible for what I am publishing. Editors are responsible all the time. It is not enough to say, well, how do you achieve scale? How could you get it up so quickly? If you're sitting at a newspaper and someone comes in with a wild rumor, you don't just put it up on your website because you say, well, we've got to do it quickly, we've got to do it instantly. Why does a social media platform have to let people whom they don't know post video instantly? Who died and said that had to happen? Why should it happen?
That's a gigantic question, and before we even go there, we have to turn to the people in the room. I'm sorry. And in
okay.
fact, I would love it if somebody here wants to jump in on that exact topic. We could spend the entire evening talking about that, but we promised we would come back to you. We're going to put the results up on the screen as a starting place, but I just want to look, anybody have a response to that question, that big question related to moderation on private sector platforms? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Go for it.
Facebook, they don't think of themselves as publishers. They think of themselves as platforms, as a public utility.
That's
so
because they got
don't-
230.
Right.
Well, here, I'll throw in something. Do we like a lot of these platforms are functioning like the public square. And once they're in that role, arguably, we want to think about them in the same way we'd think about government restriction on speech. So,
I fundamentally don't agree with that.
Okay, well, that's the
They are
debate.
private companies.
and it's their speech. So
So
they,
it's their speech. It's called editing.
Right.
Moderating is called editing. It's not a public square. It is a private square. The fact that through business genius they have gotten to be so gigantic and so dominant is a different set of issues. But it is not the public square.
to me, this is the conceptual question that is in front of us. How do we conceive of them? How do we conceptualize them? And then what are the responsibilities that flow from that? But I think this is the debate. And certainly, you raised this earlier today, if they were to take the same approach you take with NewsGuard, you would want them to be public about what those standards are. And I think a lot of the problem that has been raised.
That is the big problem. It's
The transparency issue.
They rate
Yeah.
the reliability and trustworthiness of news sites
Yeah.
exactly the way we do.
They just don't
Only
tell
for
you.
them, it counts for millions of dollars in advertising for those sites.
Yeah.
But those sites have
Yeah.
no idea what their rating is.
Yeah.
And if they asked, they wouldn't tell them.
Yep, I see. Ambassador Freed.
I think the stronger position with respect to the question we're discussing is to emphasize social media's responsibility for integrity and transparency
Yeah.
rather than content control. Now, that said, I don't want to push content control down to zero. Pornography, beheading videos, legitimate questions about anti-vaccine sites, threats to public health. There is room for discussion about content control, but generally, to discuss the issue of editorial responsibility of social media platforms, I think there is far more that can be done with less controversy in the realm of integrity and transparency, including labeling, right? Mandatory labeling, green or red according to the criteria, rather than getting into the area of content control, because what we in this audience decide are proper criteria may not be the same as, say, the U.S. Congress. A fairness doctrine from the 1960s in network television applied to the internet. I want to think hard before we go there. Anyway, that's where I would come out on the issues, and that's what my colleague Alina Polyakova and I argued in our Democratic Defense Against Disinformation paper. Anyway, that's just, one paper's opinion.
Question for you. Do you consider the 9 criteria that NewsGuard uses content control or integrity control?
Integrity and transparency, mainly. I'd have to look at them more, but I don't think that I was hearing content control.
No, not at all.
So
The content, we have sites, the Heritage Foundation's daily newsletter, the Daily Signal, which is about as far right as you can get, gets the exact same 100% rating as the Center for American Progress. In fact, I think it gets a higher rating. This is not about content. It is about, you use, integrity is the word. We use, journalistic standards. I hope that's the same thing because I'm a journalist, but I think it is. And when I'm talking about content control, what I think I said was something different. I think publishers ought to be responsible. I ran a cable television channel in the United States, and the stuff I put on the air, I should be responsible for. Now, I happen to be a First Amendment absolutist, so that responsibility doesn't really stretch that far, but I should be responsible for the decisions I make. I should be embarrassed if I make bad decisions that aren't illegal decisions. I should be able to be sued if I make decisions that are damaging to people in a way where I don't have a First Amendment defense. And I don't see why the richest platforms in the world aren't held to the same standard, except for the fact that they had, their predecessors had some very good lobbyists.
Let's look at, just 1 second response on all of this. Let's look at the social media concept and material as being more like a conversation while walking in the public square and not the public square itself. People want to share information among their friends, etc. They want to post videos on how to do this or that. I just learned how to fix my computer by looking at a video because there was no other way of doing it. So they're very different concepts. They're not holding themselves out to be the Independent or the New York Times. And they serve a very different role in society. I think if you were to say, okay, we're going to eliminate completely the safe harbor, you would find that companies would not be in a position to be able to post
No,
any
I
of
think you should
the...
eliminate safe harbor, but I think that they ought to be held to a standard of some kind of due care for what they're doing. It is, what you've just described is a business model where, lucky them, they get all their content for free because everybody writes it for free. That's a really good business. but they ought to be held responsible in some way. They ought to have a safe harbor for the reason that content companies should have a safe harbor, but just a total free pass is, how's it working out?
It's not totally a free pass, but I think there are other issues that we want to
So many issues. I see somebody here have a question?
I was just with Facebook in Berlin, coming back 2 days ago.
Yep.
They are trying to set up an oversight content board.
Yep.
They don't have a governance structure for it yet, not at all. They're trying to think about this.
Yeah.
But I think one thing for sure is this. Now, public space is now on private hands, but it's a public good. Now, if you ever thought of democracy that way, both Kant and Rousseau and the rest of the Enlightenment proved turn over in their grave twice. Because it was never an idea that the infrastructure that runs democracy should be on private hands. Now, the question is, are they up to the task of becoming civil servant actors now, or not? The way it looks right now is, of course, they're making a buck on this, so that's probably going to be hard. But it seems at least that there are certain tendencies within at least Facebook going in a direction that they have to sort of sacrifice some of their, some of their infrastructure for actually providing in a certain way, at least part of the infrastructure running democracy. And a very good example of that is hashtag delete Facebook during the Cambridge Analytica. Where did that hashtag go on? On Facebook. So there you have it. And then we take that traffic too. But it does go to show that in a certain sense, they're very much responsible for the public square, but on private hands. And that runs perpendicular to a fundamental understanding of what democracy is all about.
Yep. And there's a difference between content-based rules in the community guidelines and algorithmic curation, which is not visible to the public. Those are very different things. And as I understand it, the draft for their oversight board is focused on the content-based rules.
Yeah, not the content.
So,
We founded our company on the notion that Facebook and all of those places should want to license us and companies licensed like us and give people the option to get more information about who's feeding them the news. Lucky for us, so far, it's the internet service providers who are stepping up to the plate, along with Microsoft. But that's the idea, is give people information. Don't stop anything. Don't block anything. And they would be more responsible if they made some effort to give people information about their sources. Who are these websites?
so I want to see, is there anybody, let's just, you have to say, go ahead, Olaf.
Yeah, just to take advantage that we have Marc with us, or
Yeah.
I was wondering, because we had this conversation on deepfake over the days, or if a concept like NewsGuard would be possible, technically possible, thinkable actually, to transfer it to AI related content, so where we because you said NewsGuard is the difference or the opposite to an algorithm. So, but there is algorithm content produced which a journalist cannot just, you cannot identify actually what is the real, what is the fake.
You mean in terms of images?
In terms of, yeah, of course, audio and video. So the entry audio we had actually, so is so close to the reality. We had it here, so with the two clips Marc presented actually, so with the first actually everyone I think said, okay, that's the algorithm. With the second half of the audience thought this is the real Trump, but it was still the algorithm. So imagine technology is proceeding in this speed, so we will be faced with content where you cannot take an analog approach like NewsGuard, and that's by all respect, and transfer it actually to AI-produced content. So therefore, back to the question, is something like an add-on for my browser thinkable on the basis of AI so that I get either a green check or a red cross if I click on a website and I see a video or a content? So because there's an algorithm actually linked to this and it tells me, okay, there's 70% that this is synthetic created media you're watching.
The short answer is probably not anytime soon. So you should think of artificial intelligence as probably superhuman at any task that a person can do in about a second. So things like recognizing objects or speech to text or these kind of things, depending on how much money you're willing to spend on it, you can probably get above human performance. For instance, any game that we ever invent from now on, computers will be the best players of that game. But it's not true that for highly complicated questions where context matters a great deal, AI is better. So it's sort of one way of thinking about this is imagine you had like 1,000 8-year-old interns, the kind of things that the tasks that you could set those interns, or 1 million of them. Those are the sort of things that AI can do well. And so the way that we would imagine doing something like this is you build tools to help journalists scale. So, the kind of deepfake tools, we would hope that they would eventually sit in a kind of NewsGuard type interface where the journalists have access to a load of tools. So maybe they have, they first run an audio clip through a few different scanners, and then they check the text. They pull the text out and they check to see whether that's been published anywhere else on the internet. And you can imagine like a set of tools that allow them to be much, much more effective at their jobs. And actually, broadly speaking, that's generally how we see AI used across the economy right now. It's still a long, long way off human level intelligence. So it tends to be a tool to augment things, to take the boring tasks, to make them faster and at larger scale. And so it can help, but as a piece of this puzzle, not the final answer.
Go ahead.
Hi. Full disclosure, I work for NewsGuard, so this might be a slightly biased answer or response. I think sort of taking both of the different solutions, AI and human, into account to respond to Ola's question might be the emphasis on verification of sources. So a video that's published by the BBC will have a different weight than a video that is published by an anonymous user on Twitter. And so I think one of the things that NewsGuard does is it helps individual users be critical about the information they encounter online and teaches them sort of concrete ways and things that they can look towards, whether it's disclosure of ownership and financing, about disclosure of content creators, whether the website publishes corrections, whether they've been flagged by a fact-checking source. Those are all things that if we can equip individual users how to look out for those things themselves and maybe say, well, an anonymous video doesn't carry the same credibility as a video produced or published by a verifiable news outlet, then I think we might sort of be on the right track. But again, it comes back to educating individual users.
Yeah. I just have to say that idea, it's very potent that the provenance is of the material. It becomes much more important than the content itself or even the veracity of the content. But I have to say the original idea of the internet was to move away from that. It was democratizing the means of distributing content. And there are real benefits of that. There happen to be gargantuan costs. And we're going back to the old school way we used to assess information. It doesn't mean we get rid of everything, like every...
No, I mean...
Yeah.
When you get down to 2,300 websites in the United States, you are doing blogs about the Denver school system that are getting green ratings. And plus anyone who requests that we rate them, we will rate them. We are determined not to be just, well, that's mainstream media, that's a newspaper that's been around 100 years, it's got to be terrific.
Yep. Okay, that's great. Listen, I know we're a little bit close to time, in fact, slightly past. I want to look up at the results, and I notice, so it turns out, this is an interesting thing, on this first question of which forms of disinformation are most problematic in your home context, micro-targeting, political advertising on digital platforms is the first, got the most votes. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that in your home context.
Can we just find out what people's home context is? How many people are from the US here? And Europe? Wow.
Why is that
Other continents?
disinformation?
Other continents?
It's not.
Why are you calling that disinformation?
It depends what the micro-targeted adverts are,
That's
but
not
you're right, it doesn't
disinformation.
have to be.
Well, some of it is.
Well, maybe,
That's right.
But as a generic
That's-
form,
that's-
it's not by
that's-
definition
you're right.
disinformation the way everything else
It gets more into
is.
the manipulation space. It can get into the manipulate. It's about what we were talking about at lunch. Okay, next, can you do the next slide? Which of the following are you most concerned about? Government inaction versus so you're more, well, it's not that far apart. Of the Europeans, are you, how do I divide this? I'm betting that the people in Europe are more concerned about inaction. I wonder about, of the Americans in the room, how many of you are more concerned about inaction? And how many of you are more concerned about overreaction? Yeah, it's really, so there is a need for a transatlantic dialogue, I bet, on that topic. And then the last question? It's some combination, big surprise, yeah. So I think
shocking.
the big takeaway here of this conversation is we've heard about technology solutions, journalist engagement, various different kinds of roles for government besides regulation, and certainly different type of engagement from the platforms. And I think the bottom line is we are all in this together, and it is absolutely all hands on deck. And I wish this whole conference had been about this topic, because I think we could have taken up the whole time. So thank you all for coming. Good job.